Now, last but most certainly not least, this episode will serve as the finale to my podcast series on women in the war industry. But I would say this one is going to be thebomb.com. Throughout this episode, I am going to explain the experiences of women who worked in munitions factories during World War I and how they knowingly put their lives in danger, some parts unknowingly, to directly supply the war effort. Tune in so I may show you further evidence that these women worked in dangerous fields, and I will show you what their jobs were like and even the lasting impacts their jobs had on their health. As I'm sure you know, Germany invaded Belgium on August 4th of 1914, causing Britain to declare war, leading to hundreds of men enlisting every hour for the war. But this massive rush to enlist left millions of open positions on the production line. So, women were called to fill that gap. As you remember from our first episode, they didn't create new positions for women. Women filled in the gaps, and here were some gaps. As I discussed in the first episode, women were essential to keep production lines flowing. But even though they were essential to keep the production lines flowing, they were paid half the amount that men made while doing the same jobs as men. It was during World War I that artillery became the prime method of destruction. So no more hand-to-hand combat was needed as the wars passed, but instead bombs were used. But with the heavy usage of bombs came the great need of them and shortages in their production. Parliament adopted the National Munitions Policy that basically stated all eligible factories producing non-essential goods needed to switch over to producing munitions to support the war effort, or switching over to other means of supporting the war effort. Luckily, women were able to provide a great amount of manpower in order to help ramp up munitions productions for the war effort. Along with the National Munitions Policy, factories were supposed to provide good pay and better working conditions for its workers. Now, I couldn't find specific evidence on the better pay and working conditions being provided, but it was mentioned briefly in the article. During World War I, munitions factories were the largest employers of women, with over 900,000 women being employed in the munitions industry in Great Britain during World War I. In June of 1917, the munitionettes produced over 50 million artillery shells in 1 year. So it was reported in June. They made 50 million artillery shells in 1 year. Can you imagine? Now, while all of these things about women being top producers in the munitions industry is great, munitions work was dangerous. And I'm not just talking about the potential of being blown up either. In an article from World War I or World War II, there was a report about World War I talking about munitions, specifically the TNT productions of World War I, where 400 cases of toxic jaundice were caused due to the overexposure to TNT. This article was warning workers who were going to be in productions during World War II of previous cases of toxic jaundice of munitions workers, since munitions factories were going to be opening back up during World War II. Toxic jaundice was a threat, besides exploding, that women faced when dealing with TNT production. While women knowingly subjected themselves to the potential of being blown up, it was actually unclear whether or not they knew the dangers of toxic jaundice and overexposure to TNT. TNT itself not only has the ability to give people liver failure, gastritis, or anemia, but it also can quite literally turn the skin yellow from a chemical in it called citric acid can turn the skin yellow on contact. Also alongside toxic jaundice and liver failure causing people to turn yellow from the inside out, citric acid turns people yellow from the outside in. Interesting. Toxic jaundice is, like the other two diseases I mentioned throughout the podcast series, of an industrial origin, but in this case, it's from working with explosives and not chemicals like phosphorus. Well, it is a chemical, so it is just like working with phosphorus and radium. Added to the list of dangers during World War I or before World War I, am I right? When filling shells, bombs, grenades, and ammunition with TNT, those who get it directly on their skin or breathe in its fumes are in danger of contracting the diseases I mentioned earlier. So, very similar again to working with phosphorus and radium, touching it or breathing in its fumes is a way to absorb it. The direct point of contact and absorption is through the skin or through the lung, especially when there's not proper measures taken to protect against its harmful chemicals. I also couldn't find evidence for this. The Canary Girls is a little bit more obscure of a topic, but I couldn't find evidence whether proper measures were taken in the factories. So it's neither here nor there whether they were actively protecting themselves against exposure. Besides toxic jaundice, workers could contract gastritis, as I mentioned above, through breathing in or the swallowing of TNT particles, and the most common way to prevent this was to drink milk prior to your shift. Not only does milk give you strong bones, but apparently it can prevent against a number of things. It's not a miracle drug, but let's go with it. That is what the article said. Many of those who had toxic jaundice turned yellow because that is what it is. Liver failure, you turn yellow. Again, also the citric acid. And unfortunately, all of this led to people passing away because there was no true treatment, again, just like the other two cases we talked about. And milk is not a miracle drug. Yes, it calms an upset stomach from low-grade cases of gastritis, but it is not a miracle. So while toxic jaundice affected a lesser number of people than gastritis or anemia, which there's not really a whole lot of data on anemia, which was why I'm not mentioning it. But again, while toxic jaundice affected a lesser number of people and took longer to contract, it was actually the most harmful because people did die. So overall, women who worked in munitions had an incredibly dangerous job, knowingly being exposed to explosives and unknowingly being exposed to chemicals, and they had little compensation and suffered great consequences for the sake of production. So throughout this podcast series, as I've shown you, women worked hard for their companies, but suffered greatly at the hands of those they worked for. Women workers not only went underpaid and underappreciated, but they also developed debilitating diseases that severely harmed them or even led to their deaths. It is in my hope that you take these stories to heart and seek to educate others on women who worked in industry and the war industry more specifically. I hope that I have given you a glimpse into the types of work women did in the industrial fields, that I showed you what their jobs were like and what they experienced, as well as showing you the lasting impact those jobs left on their health. So next time you or someone you know dresses up as a Rosie the Riveter, while it's not the profession we were talking about during this podcast series, please do take the opportunity to educate them on women working in the war industry and how their work was not glamorous and not ideal. Thank you so much for listening. I had such a joy putting this together. Thank you again.